A Fire, I'm Mike Papantonio. Across the country, there's a growing disconnect between the political ideology of state government and the voters who put those people in power. Thanks to gerrymandering, progressive majorities are being shut out. I have attorneys Joe Cotchett and Dave Tissell with me to talk about that problem. Joe, as I take a look at what's happening with what people have described as the purity purge that's taken place where it comes to the GOP, the place we're seeing it most is in the states where we can hardly recognize, where you really can almost barely recognize any diversity where it comes to political thought with the Republicans. How do you see this happening, affecting the national scene of politics, Joe?
Well, obviously the red states are getting redder, the blue states are getting bluer, and I think what you have to look at is the population base. The fact that there are the houses of both houses are controlled in 23 states by Republicans. I think it's either 11 or 12 that the Democrats control both houses and, so to speak, how you're going to pass your laws. However, what you have to look at is the population base. The population base of California, for example, which is now we have a veto-proof, literally a veto-proof Democratic situation. The population base is now 40 million people. That means 1 out of every 8 people here in California are tending towards Democratic philosophy. However, it is clear that in the middle portion of our country, the red states are becoming redder, and the trick there is voter ID to get people off the registration of voting rolls and make sure that they are able to control the vote. Therein lies the Republican philosophy's problem. For example, Hispanics continue to move away from the Republican Party. Hispanics are the fastest growing element of our population.
David, let me ask you this. Wisconsin, there's a story, if you take a look at it, with Wisconsin, with Pennsylvania, with places like Michigan, where you've seen, as Joe just described, this new control of, as he pointed out, 23 state houses, also with a governor, compared for Republicans, about 12 for Democrats. But as you look at a place like Wisconsin, here's a state that has really a blue ideology, a blue philosophy where it comes to national elections, the presidential elections. But look at what's happening in the states. Same way with Pennsylvania. What's your thought about this chasm that's developed there?
Well, there's an amazing polarization going on within state politics. Mike, there's been a new study that came out by 2 guys, Boris Shore from the University of Chicago and Nolan McCarthy from Princeton, that analyzed the state political climate in all of the states and found that the gap is really growing between the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans are becoming more and more conservative and becoming more and more liberal, so that we don't have the moderates governing this country. We don't have a voice for the moderates in this country, but we have our 2 extremes, and frankly, the conservative being the one that's growing the most. And when we talk about Wisconsin, that's an excellent example. Here's a state that is a blue state, regularly votes in the presidential election for Democrats. Yet Scott Walker gets elected as governor by the extreme right-wing Republicans in his party. And when he's elected, passes very extreme anti-union, anti-labor laws that go against the best interest of the majority of his own people. We aren't governing for, the problem with the polarization is that those who are elected are governing for the 47% who elect them, not for everyone.
Not for the middle. Joe, in California, you don't see polarization quite so much because you have almost complete control by the Democrats, as you point out. That's not the case in a lot of states where, you may have a situation in a lot of states where you have absolute gridlock. The state can't move ahead with education. They can't move ahead with safety net issues, infrastructure issues. They're absolutely in a gridlock death. What's the solution? I don't know that there's a quick way out of it.
No. I realize exactly what you're saying. And I'm going to give this a little twist. that you may not like, but I don't think polarization is the real issue here. I think the real issue is money. The money that is now influencing politics coming out of Wall Street is overwhelming. It's overwhelming both parties. I see that as the real problem. I don't see moderates getting squeezed by the Republicans and or the Democrats. I see them getting squeezed by Wall Street. Take a look at the economics of the situation. Now, we've been fortunate here in California to elect representatives to our state house, both Senate and the Assembly, who are coming from a working class background that hopefully will not be swallowed up by the money that's out there. It is the gridlock in Washington has to do with K Street. K Street is the money street. When the money street walks down the street, so to speak, to the Capitol and delivers, and I don't want to be facetious about this, but literally delivers bags of cash, therein lies the polarization.
Joe, you've been involved in politics an awful long time, in leadership roles, from inside, outside. You've watched it your entire adult life. Is this the worst that you've ever seen from what you can remember?
Beyond doubt. Beyond doubt. As a matter of fact,
David,
just to give you an example of Wall Street, I see a situation recently where some members of the House, Democrats, by the way, have introduced some legislation, and sadly, it may go somewhere because the Republicans are going to buy into it right away to reduce regulation of the derivative market. Now, I don't want to get too exotic. I don't want to get too exotic about what derivatives are, but simply put, they're introducing legislation now that'll make it easier for Wall Street to manipulate the monetary currency by which we operate.
To rip off mom and pop. David, let me ask you, isn't part of the problem is that state politics are not really run at the top of state politics? They're run from a national scene that might be driven by one mind. Could you talk about that a little bit, David?
Absolutely. And to build on what Joe just said, I think money is the key issue. A little money can go a long way in state political races, much further than in the national, at the national level. And what we're seeing, not only from K Street, not only from Wall Street, but we're now seeing the national political parties, the Republican Party, putting over $30 million into the last election, into state elections, where it's not about what the state individuals in each state want. It's about these major national agendas that are being pushed by Wall Street, being pushed by the Republican Party, and that becomes a real problem in Middle America.
Joe, in the end, isn't part of the problem that when you have I'm going to call it polarization, but let's call it whatever you want. It may be where we have a place like Michigan, sure, where we have a Republican governor with a state that typically leans blue, or Pennsylvania, the same thing, where you've got the Republicans in charge, that they're deconstructing the welfare reform, they're deconstructing education, but the voters don't really want that. Isn't this control of the GOP state by state, isn't it something that doesn't really reflect what most voters want? They want something different, but they're not getting it from their state legislators because it's being driven from the top from the national scene.
And you see, it's getting easier and easier to drive that scene because, to give you one quick example, let me cite the city of Los Angeles. We just elected the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, which, what is Los Angeles? Second or third largest city in the nation? 23% of the population. On election day, only 15% went to the polls. 23% went to the polls to elect the mayor of one of the largest cities in the country. So what's happening, you see, is the middle class is falling out. By falling out, I mean they're just not interested anymore in the political body. So when you have the smaller and smaller voter turnout, the easier it is for money to control what's happening around the country, and the Republican Party sees this. By the way, Democrats are quickly learning, as Dave just pointed out, What they spend, $30 million last year, the Republican National on state
yes.
elections. So now I think the Democrats put in 12. Watch, this year the Democrats will up the ante, the Republicans will up the ante. The real problem is the base of voters. So if you can pass a voter ID law, that means when you go to the polls, you got to show not only your license to drive a car, you got to show your birth certificate, you got to bring your mother and father with you. I mean, it is preposterous.
Well, David, isn't part of the problem what Joe's talking about here? You have, as we've talked about before, you have an increase in Latino voters. The numbers are rising, but at the same time, the turnout of young Latinos is not necessarily all that impressive.
That's the key.
Add to that what Joe says is
Absolutely.
that add the other thing, and that is we're going to discourage them. Isn't that kind of part of what we're going to see a lot more from the Republicans as we go forward?
Oh, absolutely. I think Pennsylvania is a textbook example of what's going to happen going forward. Pennsylvania is a blue state. Pennsylvania has more Democrats than Republicans, but they have a Republican governor, and they passed one of the most aggressive voter ID laws that was targeted at keeping young Latino voters and keeping keeping the young people and the minorities from voting. I mean, that's what it was about.
Right. Joe, isn't this just, this is kind of, to me, though, when I look at this story, it's kind of like the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike,
yes,
holding, just hoping for the best. Isn't that kind of what the GOP is doing right now?
Absolutely.
They kind of have the finger in the dike, don't they?
They do. However, they want to make sure that finger stays in that dike, and they want to figure out a way to build a bigger, more stronger dike by tearing down just what David said. Pennsylvania is such a great example of the situation that we're facing out there. We not only have to get people to the polls, we have to incentivize people as to why they want to go out and vote.
Yes.
Therein
Yes.
lies the problem. We are not getting the message to people that, look, if you elect X, your Social Security is gone. Something that this country in the last decade, in the last 100 years, it's the most important piece of legislation ever passed, was in ensuring that senior citizens had something for which they contributed to which this country owes them an obligation to live by. That Social Security is under attack, and unfortunately, people don't understand that.
Gentlemen, thank you. This is a story that I'm really interested to see whether the polarization that takes place state by state changes the fundamentals of our culture. I think it has the potential to do that. But this is something we want to follow now and in years to come. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Mike.
Mike, very much.